Shreveport calls itself the heart of North Louisiana. 30% of its murders are domestic. A man who threatened to kill his family 3 years before he did. A VA that discharged him 2 months prior. A stolen gun. 8 children, aged 3 to 11, found shot in their beds on a Sunday morning. This is Shreveport's deadliest morning that nobody saw coming. Section 1. Cedar Grove. Before 6 in the morning on April 19, 2026, a woman named Keosha Pugh climbed out of a window onto the roof of a house on the 300 block of West 79th Street in Shreveport, Louisiana, and called 911 from the tiles. She told the dispatcher that a man was inside, that someone had been shot, and that she could hear the children. A second call came minutes later confirming the suspect's name. A third call said he had shot everyone in the house. By the time officers located the victims at 6:43 in the morning, 8 children between the ages of 3 and 11 were dead inside. Many of them had been shot in the head while they slept. Shreveport is a city of roughly 180,000 people in the far northwest corner of Louisiana, close enough to the Texas and Arkansas state lines that it has always occupied a kind of in-between position in the regional geography of the South. It is not New Orleans. It does not carry the weight of that city's mythology, the jazz and the Mardi Gras, and the particular romance that American culture has assigned to the state's largest port. Shreveport is older than any of that mythology would suggest. It was chartered in 1839, built around the Red River trade, and for most of the 19th century, it was the most important inland city in northern Louisiana, a hub for cotton and then oil, and then the slow diversification that every mid-sized American city has had to negotiate across a long 20th century. It grew around Barksdale Air Force Base, which remains one of the largest employers in the region. It has universities. It has a downtown corridor of glass and brick that the city's promotional materials describe in the language of renewal. Casinos sit on the riverfront where the freight trade used to move. What Shreveport also has, and what its own elected officials have said out loud for years, is a domestic violence problem of a size that sets it apart even in a country where domestic violence kills thousands of people every year. Grayson Boucher, a member of the Shreveport City Council, stated publicly in April 2026 that more than 30% of the city's crimes and more than 30% of its murders fall into the category of domestic in nature. That is not a statistic that emerges from one bad year. It reflects a pattern that city officials, social workers, and law enforcement in Caddo Parish have discussed in public forums, funding arguments, and council sessions for the better part of a decade. The infrastructure to respond to that pattern has never caught up with the scale of it. In March 2026, just weeks before the Sunday morning that would define the city's year, the Shreveport City Council voted to withdraw from a partnership with the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office that had been intended to establish a domestic violence resource center at a new police substation. The partnership fell apart in a disagreement over operational structure. The center did not open. The mayor's office said at the time that the city was working toward a comprehensive alternative. The alternative was not yet in place. None of that political history was visible on the streets of Cedar Grove on the evening of April 18, 2026. What was visible was ordinary. A man named Freddie Montgomery sat on the front porch of his home on the block, as he had done many times before. He later told reporters that he could see across the street to a house where a neighbor lived with his wife and their children. He saw the man come out at some point that afternoon or early evening. They exchanged a wave. Children were playing in the yard. There was nothing in that Saturday that announced itself as the last Saturday those children would see. Montgomery went inside, and he slept, and when he woke the next morning and pulled back his curtains, there were police vehicles on the street that had not been there when he fell asleep. He walked outside. He asked an officer whether the scene was bad. The officer said yes. Montgomery asked whether there were fatalities. Multiple, the officer said. He asked whether children had died. The officer told him multiple again. The conversation, by any measure, should never have happened. The fact that it did is what this story is about. The shooting on April 19, 2026, took place across what police described as 3 primary crime scenes, with investigators eventually processing 5 related sites across the Cedar Grove neighborhood and into Bossier City. It began just before 6 in the morning, when a caller reached the Shreveport Police Department's emergency dispatch line and reported being on the roof of a house on the 300 block of West 79th Street. The caller said a man was inside the house. The caller said someone had been shot. Then a second call came in, and the caller provided a name. A third call arrived minutes later, and the caller reported that the suspect had shot everyone inside the home and that she had fled with her children from the roof. The police timeline shows the first officers arriving on Harrison Street at 6 minutes past 6. At 43 minutes past 6, officers located the victims at the West 79th Street address. Between those two timestamps, 6 children and 1 more were already dead inside a house that had appeared quiet from the street. Shreveport Police Chief Wayne Smith stood before cameras on Sunday and said it was a tragic situation, and that it might be the worst tragic situation the city had ever faced. He was not reaching for dramatic language. He was describing arithmetic. The Caddo Parish Coroner's Office confirmed later in the week that the deaths of the 8 children more than doubled the total number of homicides recorded in Shreveport and Caddo Parish for the year to that point. A single event, in a single morning, on 2 ordinary streets in Cedar Grove, had reshaped the city's murder statistics for 2026 in a way that made the usual context of urban crime statistics feel entirely inadequate. The numbers stopped being numbers very quickly. Mayor Tom Arsenault was among the first city officials to speak publicly on that Sunday. He described the scene as horrific. He said it rattled the entire city. He was correct on both counts, but the city's response to being rattled would become, in the weeks after, as much a part of the story as the events of the morning itself. Because what became clear almost immediately, as reporters and investigators and family members began to piece together what had happened, was that Sunday morning had not arrived without warning. The warnings had been present. They had been communicated to people who were in a position to act. They had not, in any meaningful institutional sense, been acted upon. What the city council had failed to build, what the VA system had discharged without adequate follow-through, what the police department had not been told about in any formal record, and what a family had tried to manage inside its own circle without access to the tools that might have changed the outcome, all of those threads came together before dawn on a Sunday in April. They came together in a house on West 79th Street where 8 children were sleeping. The youngest was 3 years old. The Cedar Grove neighborhood is the kind of place that American urban journalism tends to describe briefly and move past. It sits in the southern portion of Shreveport's grid, characterized more by its residential density than by any landmark or commercial anchor. It is predominantly black. It has, like much of Shreveport's south side, experienced the slow disinvestment that follows manufacturing decline, suburban sprawl, and the contraction of the kind of mid-tier employment that once sustained working-class neighborhoods across the American South. It is not a neighborhood in crisis in any cinematic sense. People live there, raise families there, know their neighbors. Freddie Montgomery waved at the man across the street. Children played in the yard. The ordinariness of that is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The violence that arrived before sunrise on April 19 did not come from outside Cedar Grove. It came from inside a family, and it had been building for a long time. To understand how it built requires going back beyond that Sunday, beyond the spring of 2026, beyond even the years that Shreveport's domestic violence statistics reflect as aggregate numbers without names. It requires going back to a man named Shamar Elkins, who was 31 years old when the morning of April 19 ended his life and the lives of the 8 children he had fathered or helped raise. It requires looking at the structure of his relationships, the record of his behavior, the moments when other people saw what was coming and were left without a mechanism adequate to stop it. It requires looking at the gun, at the court date that never happened, at the phone call 2 weeks before the shooting in which Elkins told his stepfather that some people did not come back from their demons. And it requires looking honestly at a city and a system that knew parts of this and could not assemble those parts into an intervention in time. Shreveport had a domestic violence resource center that was not yet built. The city had an epidemic, in the words of Councilman Boucher, that had been documented and discussed and not yet adequately funded. The Gun Violence Archive recorded that 2026 had already seen more than 100 mass shootings across the United States by the morning of April 19th, using the definition of 4 or more people shot in a single incident. What happened in Cedar Grove was, by the measurement of the same database, the deadliest mass shooting in the country since a gunman killed 8 people in a Chicago suburb in January 2024. That 2-year gap meant that when the news came out of Shreveport on a Sunday morning, the country's media infrastructure had not been asked to report on an event of this scale for a long time. The coverage arrived quickly and in volume. The city had not been prepared for either the event or the coverage. What the coverage found, in the days and weeks that followed, was a story that sat at the intersection of several American crises that are individually well documented and collectively still unresolved. Domestic violence, and the particular danger of the separation period when an abusive partner recognizes that control is ending. The inadequacy of mental health infrastructure for veterans, and the gap between a VA system that can hospitalize someone and the community support structures that should exist after discharge. The legal loopholes and informal channels through which people prohibited from owning firearms continue to obtain them, and the specific documented failure of a city council to maintain a domestic violence center at the precise moment when its absence would matter most. None of those crises was new on April 19, 2026. What was new was the 8 children. Jayla Elkins was 3, Shayla Elkins was 5, Kadarian Snow was 6, Kayla Pugh was 6, Layla Pugh was 7, Markaden Pugh was 10, Braylon Snow was 5, Soraya Snow was 11. They had all been sleeping. Many, according to the first responders who arrived at the house on West 79th Street, appeared to have been shot in the head while they lay in their beds. Police Corporal Chris Bordelon, speaking to reporters outside the crime scene on that Sunday, described the scene as disgusting and evil. He was a police spokesperson using the measured language of that professional function, and he could not maintain it. The house had been too much. By the time the sun was fully up over Cedar Grove on April 19, 2026, Shreveport had already become the city where 8 children were killed before breakfast on a Sunday. The neighborhood that most of its 180,000 residents had driven past without stopping had become the center of a national conversation about what American cities owe the families living within them and what they fail to provide. That conversation, as it tends to in America, would produce intense media coverage, public statements of grief and outrage, and calls for structural change. What it had not produced yet, because it was still Sunday morning and the bodies were still being counted, was any accounting of the full sequence of events that had made the morning possible. That accounting begins not on West 79th Street, and not in April. It begins earlier, in a life that had already carried a great deal of weight before it arrived at the point where a man with a .22 caliber Mossberg 715P pistol walked through a house where his own children were sleeping and ended each of them. The city, the neighborhood, the 2 houses, the police response timeline, the statistics on the whiteboard in the councilman's office, all of it is context. But the center of this story is a man, the children he fathered and killed, the women he shot, and the years of signs that accumulated without producing a force strong enough to break what was coming. Cedar Grove was where it ended. It did not begin there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Shreveport's long-documented domestic violence crisis and the political failure weeks earlier to establish a resource center sit behind all of it. Next, the life of Shamar Elkins, from a childhood in which he was given away to a family friend, to the man who waved at his neighbor the evening before the shooting. Section 2. The Man Across the Street. On Matthew Place in Shreveport, a residential street in the northwestern part of the city, a confrontation happened one afternoon in 2019 that would come to define the legal record of the man who lived there. A car pulled up outside the address numbered 8020. Words were exchanged. According to what the resident told police, a passenger in the car produced a weapon and pointed it at him. The car began to pull away. The resident fired 5 rounds from a 9mm handgun at the vehicle as it left. The bullets traveled in the direction of the departure, and the departure led toward a school. Caddo Middle Magnet was less than 1,000 feet away. Children were playing on the grounds outside it when the shots were fired. One bullet was recovered near the school fence. Nobody was hit. That afternoon, and what the courts did with it afterward, would become one of the central questions of April 2026. Not because the episode was itself the cause of what happened 7 years later, but because the legal resolution of it created a gap in a record that might otherwise have been sufficient to prevent a man from obtaining a firearm at all. The man who fired those 5 rounds was named Shamar Elkins. He was 24 years old in 2019. He was 31 when he died on a street in Bossier City in the early morning hours of April 19, 2026, having shot 10 people across 2 addresses in Cedar Grove, 8 of whom were children, and 7 of whom were his own. Shamar Elkins was born on December 7, 1994, in Shreveport. His mother, Mahalia Elkins, was a teenager when he was born and was, by her own account in interviews given after April 2026, struggling with an addiction to crack cocaine at the time of his birth and in the years that followed. She was not able to raise him. The decision that followed, or perhaps the accumulation of circumstances that made a formal decision unnecessary, was that a woman named Betty Walker would take on the role of caregiver for the boy. Walker was a family friend, not a relative in any legal sense, but she provided what Mahalia at that point could not. Elkins grew up in her household. The details of those early years, the schools he attended, the neighborhood streets he moved through as a child, the relationships he formed, are not extensively documented in the public record. What is documented is the broad shape of a childhood defined by a mother's absence and a substitute family's presence, which is a pattern familiar enough in American life to require no dramatic framing. It happened, and it shaped him, in ways that even the people who knew him best said they could not fully trace. Mahalia Elkins and her son reconnected, according to what she told reporters, sometime in the mid-2010s, when Elkins was already an adult. By that point, the formal distance of his upbringing had been replaced by something looser, a relationship conducted through phone calls and visits, and the kind of intermittent contact that grows up between a parent and a child who find each other late. She told the New York Times that she had texted him on the Tuesday before the shooting, asking how the children were doing. He replied that everyone was doing fine. The text messages were seen by the Times reporter. Mahalia Elkins had no reason, based on that exchange, to believe that the following Sunday would be what it was. The text is part of the record because it illustrates something that runs through the whole story. The way ordinary communication continued right up to the edge of violence, not revealing it, not concealing it exactly, just existing alongside it in the way that ordinary life exists alongside almost everything that eventually disrupts it. Elkins enlisted in the Louisiana Army National Guard in August 2013 when he was 18 years old. He served for 7 years until August 2020 in 2 specialist roles: Signal Support Systems Specialist, which involves the operation and maintenance of communications equipment, and Fire Support Specialist, which involves coordination between ground units and artillery or air support. Neither role took him overseas. He was never deployed. The Army confirmed after April 2026 that he had left the Guard as a private, which is the lowest enlisted rank, suggesting that his 7 years of service did not produce the kind of advancement that extended or distinguished service tends to generate. He received no deployment ribbon, no combat record, no commendation that has entered the public record. He served, and then he left, and the period of his Guard service coincides almost exactly with his early adult years in Shreveport, the years in which he was also beginning to form the domestic relationships that would eventually place him at the center of the worst Sunday morning in the city's history. What the Guard service did produce, alongside whatever sense of structure and identity it offered during those years, was a familiarity with firearms that is inherent to any military training, regardless of specialization. Signal and fire support roles require weapons qualification alongside the technical duties of the position. Elkins learned to handle guns as part of his service. That is not a remarkable observation about a National Guard veteran, but it is a relevant one when considering the 2019 incident on Matthew Place and the behavior it revealed. The court record from 2019 adds a detail that the initial reporting on the arrest left out. A later account drawing on court filings and police reports established that the confrontation outside 8020 Matthew Place had begun not with a random approach but with a dispute over marijuana. A man in the car had allegedly attempted to take Elkins's marijuana and leave without paying for it, or without returning it, and the argument had escalated from there. The passenger in the car produced a weapon. Elkins responded by drawing his own. When the car moved to leave, he fired 5 times at it. The shots went toward the school. Children were outside. One round was found near the fence line. Elkins was arrested and charged with 2 counts, illegal use of weapons and carrying a firearm on school property. The second charge was the more serious of the 2. Carrying a firearm on school property, or within the prohibited distance of one, carries penalties under Louisiana law that distinguish it from ordinary weapons violations. If that charge had resulted in conviction, the legal consequence for Elkins's ability to own or possess a firearm going forward would have been substantially more restrictive. Instead, in October 2019, Elkins appeared in Caddo District Court and pleaded guilty to the first count only. The school property charge was dismissed as part of the plea. He told the judge he held a high school degree. He was given a 1-year suspended sentence and placed on 18 months of supervised probation. He served no jail time. Under Louisiana state law, the illegal use of weapons conviction that resulted from that plea carried a prohibition on firearm ownership of at least 10 years. Elkins was, from October 2019 onward, legally barred from possessing a gun under state law. The Shreveport Police Department's own spokesman confirmed after the April 2026 shooting that Elkins had most likely been prohibited from legally owning firearms because of that conviction. The federal picture was more complicated. Under federal law, gun ownership is typically only barred following a qualifying felony conviction or a specific domestic violence misdemeanor. The charge to which Elkins pleaded guilty, and the structure of the Louisiana plea that resolved it, created enough ambiguity in the federal record that the prohibition was not reflected uniformly across the systems that licensed firearms dealers use when checking a buyer's eligibility. The ATF investigation that opened in the days after April 19, 2026, focused in part on precisely that gap. How had Elkins obtained the weapon he used on April 19? The answer, when it came, involved a man named Charles Ford and a gun that was allegedly stolen from a truck. But the legal architecture that made the question necessary to ask at all had been built in Caddo District Court on the day the school property charge was dismissed. After his probation concluded, Elkins settled into the civilian life that the people who knew him in Cedar Grove and around Shreveport described to reporters in the days after the shooting. He worked for United Parcel Service as a driver. At some point, he also worked in sanitation. He was, by the accounts of neighbors and acquaintances who did not know the interior of his domestic relationships, a recognizable presence on the block, someone who waved from the porch and whose children could be seen playing outside on weekends. The image of him that emerged from Facebook posts and the recollections of people who passed him on the street was of a man whose life appeared organized around his children. On Easter Sunday of 2026, less than 2 weeks before the shooting, he posted a photograph to Facebook of himself, surrounded by his 7 children. The caption read, in his own words, "All my kids." The Saturday before the shooting, the day before he killed them, he posted a photograph of his eldest daughter eating a burger. That gap, between the photograph and what happened the following morning, is one of the most difficult things about this case to hold in the mind without flinching. It resists the kind of narrative coherence that documentary accounts of violence tend to supply, because it does not resolve into a clear picture of a man whose exterior and interior were consistent with each other. The people who describe the man who waved from the porch, who posted Easter photographs, who drove a UPS route through Shreveport's neighborhoods, are not describing someone different from the man who was also, in the same months and years, operating inside a set of domestic relationships that had grown, by the winter of 2025 and 2026, into something far more dangerous than any of those street-level observations could capture. Betty Walker, the woman who had raised him, was one of the people who saw more of the interior than the neighbors did. Walker had stayed in Elkins's life long after the years when she served as his primary caregiver. She was a consistent presence, someone he called and visited, someone whose opinion of him as a person was informed by decades rather than by the distance across a street. Walker knew about the relationship with Shaniqua Pugh, who became Elkins's wife in 2024. She knew about Christina Snow, his ex-wife, the mother of 3 of his children. She knew about the arguments, and about the fear, and about the thing Elkins had said in 2023, when Pugh had mentioned that she was considering leaving him and taking the children. Walker said afterward that when Pugh raised the possibility of leaving, Elkins had become furious. What he said, in Walker's account, was direct. If they tried to leave, he told her, he would kill her, his kids, and himself. Walker knew this. She had heard it. The question of what she or anyone else was in a position to do with it, in the absence of a formal complaint, a police call, a protective order, is a question that the story of domestic violence in America has asked, in case after case, without producing a satisfactory institutional answer. Threats made in private, without a witness beyond the person threatened, are difficult to act on and easy to dismiss as the product of momentary rage. The research on intimate partner homicide suggests consistently that threats of this kind, especially those that include the speaker's own death alongside the deaths of family members, are among the most reliable predictors of eventual lethal violence. That research exists. It is published. It informs training programs for law enforcement and social workers in cities across the country. Whether it informed anyone's response to the situation inside the household on West 79th Street in Shreveport in 2023 is a question to which the answer, as far as the public record shows, is no. Elkins was still working at UPS in April 2026. He was still posting to Facebook. He was still, to the outside observer, the man on the porch. And inside his household, the marriage was ending. A court date had been scheduled for April 20. And the weight of what he was about to lose had been pressing on him, by all accounts of the people closest to him, for months. The 2019 conviction, the 7 years in the Guard, the childhood shaped by a mother he did not know until he was an adult, the years of arguments and custody disputes that a Washington Post account described as defining much of his adult domestic life. None of those things, individually or together, constitute a sufficient explanation for what he did. They constitute a record. And a record, looked at carefully, is not the same as an explanation, but it is where you begin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. National Guard, his 2019 weapons conviction, and the specific legal gap that left him not formally barred from obtaining a firearm under federal law. Next, the two women at the center of his domestic life, the children they had together, and the slow fracture of a household that by the winter of 2026 was already in serious trouble. Section 3. Two women. 1 block Harrison Street in Cedar Grove runs parallel to the larger arteries that carry traffic through the southern part of Shreveport. On the 500 block, a woman named Christina Snow lived in a house that sat less than a block from the house on West 79th Street where her children were sleeping on the night of April 18, 2026. The two addresses were close enough that you could walk between them in under 2 minutes. Christina Snow was 31 years old. She was the mother of 3 children. Their names were Soraya, Kadarian, and Braylon. They were 11, 6, and 5. She knew the woman who lived on West 79th Street. That woman was named Shaniqua Pugh, who had married Shamar Elkins in April 2024, and who was the mother of 4 more of Elkins's children. The two households, on 2 streets separated by the width of a city block, had been woven together for years by the children they shared, by the man who moved between them, and by the particular intimacy and friction that forms when people are bound to each other, through children, but not necessarily through choice. Elkins had known Christina Snow for a long time before he married Shaniqua Pugh. The public record on how and when their relationship began is limited, but sources confirm that he had previously been married to Snow, making Pugh his second wife. A Facebook post that Snow wrote on New Year's Eve 2015 described feeling loved by someone. The following day she posted that she had been hurt because that same person would not let her move on. That pairing of posts, from the last night of one year to the first morning of the next, is a small window into a dynamic that continued for years afterward and that produced, among its outcomes, 3 children who carried her last name and his features. Soraya Snow was born in 2014 or 2015, making her the oldest of the children who died on April 19th. Kadarian Snow was 6. Braylon Snow was 5. All 3 were fathered by Elkins. All 3 were at the West 79th Street house that night, sleeping among their half-siblings in the way children do when family arrangements have produced a household that belongs equally to both sets, without fully belonging to either. The question of why the Snow children were at the Pugh house on that Saturday night is not one the public record fully answers. The simplest explanation, and the one that fits the broader picture of how the two households functioned, is that children move between the homes of separated parents and their siblings in patterns that become ordinary over time. The 8 children who died knew each other. They were family in the most complete sense, regardless of which of the 2 women was their mother. Saria, at 11, was the oldest of the 8. She was old enough to have understood, at some level, the tensions inside the adult world she was growing up in. Whether she did or not, she was asleep in a house on West 79th Street before 6 in the morning on a Sunday, and that is where she died. Shaniqua Pugh was 34 years old in April 2026. She and Elkins had been together, according to family accounts and social media records, for roughly 10 years before they formalized the relationship with a marriage on April 9, 2024. The social media images from around the time of their wedding and in the year that followed showed the couple at family gatherings, on church trips, at occasions that read as the documentation of a life organized around children and community. 4 of those children were theirs together: Jayla, who was 3 years old, Shayla, who was 5, Kayla, who was 6, and Layla, who was 7. The 4 daughters carried the Elkins surname for 2 of them, and the Pugh name for the other 2. A small administrative artifact of a household whose structure had not followed a single straight line. By the time the marriage had reached its 2nd year, it was already ending. Shaniqua Pugh had initiated separation proceedings. A family member told the Associated Press that the couple had been arguing about the split before the shooting, and that Elkins had resisted it. Crystal Brown, a cousin of Pugh's, told USA Today that the husband did not want the divorce. A court date had been scheduled for April 20th, 2026, the Monday after the Sunday morning shooting. Divorce proceedings in Louisiana involved the formal adjudication of custody arrangements, asset division, and the legal dissolution of the marital bond. The April 20 date would have been one step in that process. It never happened. There was nothing left to adjudicate by the time Monday morning arrived. The reasons Pugh sought the divorce are reported with some variation across different accounts. One source indicated she had filed following allegations of infidelity. Whatever the specific grounds, the trajectory was clear from the accounts of people close to both of them. The marriage had reached the point where Pugh had decided it needed to end, and Elkins had decided, with equal clarity, that he could not accept that. His brother told reporters in the days after the shooting that Elkins had said, during the weeks before, that he did not want to lose his wife. The words, as reported, were direct and unambiguous about what the separation represented to him emotionally. It was not only the end of a marriage, it was the loss of the household, the daily proximity to the children, the structure that had given his adult life its center. He had said as much to his mother and stepfather in a phone call on April 5th, 2 weeks before the shooting. He described himself as drowning. The threat Elkins had made in 2023, which Betty Walker described to investigators and reporters after the shooting, sits in this context as something more legible than it might appear in isolation. Walker said that in 2023, before the marriage to Shaniqua Pugh had taken place, Pugh had raised the possibility of leaving and taking her children. Elkins responded with fury. He told her, in Walker's account, that if she tried to leave and take the children, he would kill her, his kids, and himself. That threat was made before the April 2024 wedding. Whether it was the reason Pugh ultimately married him, or whether the marriage represented a decision made in spite of it, or simply a period of genuine reconciliation that preceded the final deterioration, is not something the public record can resolve. What it can establish is that the threat existed, that it was specific in naming the children alongside the wife, that it included Elkins himself as a victim of the violence he was describing, and that the person who heard it was someone close enough to the family to be aware of the general shape of the relationship without being in a position to formally report it. Understanding why domestic violence threats of this kind so rarely result in protective intervention requires understanding the structure of the situation from every side. Pugh was the person threatened. She made the decision to stay, at least for a time, and to marry Elkins the following year. That decision does not diminish the threat or assign her responsibility for what eventually happened, but it is part of the explanation for why no formal report was made. Walker, who heard the threat from Elkins or learned of it from Pugh, was a family friend rather than a mandated reporter with a legal obligation to notify authorities. She was operating inside a family network, not a professional one, and Elkins himself, when the moment of the threat passed, continued to present to the outside world as the man on the porch, the Easter Sunday father, the UPS driver whose neighbors waved at him without anxiety. The domestic architecture of the two households on those two streets in Cedar Grove is also worth understanding for what it reveals about the logic of what happened on the morning of April 19th. Shane Nyqua Pugh's sister, Keosha Pugh, lived at the West 79th Street address. Keosha had a 12-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son named Markadon. Markadon Pugh was Elkins's nephew by marriage, the son of Elkins's brother-in-law. On the night of April 18th, all of the children were gathered under the same roof: Elkins's 4 daughters with Pugh, Christina Snow's 3 children who had come to spend the night with their half-siblings, and Markadon. 9 children were in the house. 8 of them died. The detail of Snow's children being at the West 79th Street house that night is one of the facts that most clearly demonstrates the ordinarily blended nature of the household. Children spending the night at the home of their sibling's other parent is not unusual. It is, in families where the adults have maintained workable arrangements despite separation, a normal feature of shared parenthood. It does not suggest any particular premonition. It suggests that the Saturday before Easter was a Saturday like others, and that the children were together in the way they probably had been many times before. The horror of that ordinariness is not incidental. It is the clearest possible demonstration of what familicide destroys, not just the lives directly ended, but the entire fabric of ordinary childhood that had been woven around those lives. Christina Snow survived the morning of April 19th. She survived because she was not in the house on West 79th Street when Elkins arrived there. He went to Harrison Street first, before the main attack, and shot her at her front door. Her aunt LaShun Berry told CNN that Elkins walked over to Snow's house, knocked on the door, and shot her in the face when she opened it. Snow, shot and bleeding, used Siri to call 911. That she was able to do so is one of the few facts in the April 19 timeline that can be described as fortunate. She survived. The bullet remained lodged in her face after surgery. She was released from hospital in the weeks following the shooting and had, according to Berry, no place to stay and no financial support. The house she had been living in held the memory of children who had spent their last night 1 block away. She was, as Berry described her in late April 2026, quiet and still processing and asking a question that the entire city was also asking, in its own way, without an answer ready. Shaniqua Pugh also survived. She was shot in the face inside the West 79th Street house. A bullet remained lodged in her face as well. Family members said in the weeks after the shooting that she sometimes woke in the morning before fully conscious, and in those first moments she thought the children were still alive. Then the morning assembled itself fully, and the knowledge returned. That gap between sleep and waking, and what it contains for her, is a detail that requires no elaboration. The 2 women who lived 1 block apart, who shared children with the same man, who had each in different ways been subject to his anger and his attachment, both survived him. The children did not. A March 2026 Facebook post, 1 month before the shooting, shows Elkins responding to a question asking whether he would change the mothers of his children if he could. His answer, in his own words, was that he would. The post sits alongside the Easter photographs of all 7 children, alongside the Saturday image of the eldest daughter eating a burger, alongside the wave to the neighbor across the street on the afternoon of April 18th. None of those things resolved into a coherent picture before the morning of April 19. The picture only assembled itself after the fact. That is almost always how it works. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next, the months between that threat and the shooting, the suicide attempt in February 2026, and the specific phone call 2 weeks before April 19, in which Elkins told his stepfather that some people do not come back from their demons. Section 4. The Weight of February. In February 2026, in a house in the Cedar Grove neighborhood of Shreveport, Shamar Elkins tried to end his own life. Betty Walker, the woman who had raised him, confirmed the attempt to reporters after the April 19 shooting and declined to give specifics about what happened or what method was involved. She said she did not want to discuss it. What she did confirm was that it happened, that it was in February, and that what followed was a period of medical intervention that the people who loved him believed had helped. They were watching him carefully. They were playing dominoes with him in the evenings, and suggesting walks, and asking whether he needed to eat. They were doing what people do when someone they care about has come back from the edge and they are not entirely sure the edge is behind him yet. The separation from Shaniqua Pugh had been the proximate cause of the worst of it, though the conditions underneath the separation were layered in the way these things usually are. Troy Brown, Elkins' brother-in-law, who lived at the West 79th Street house and would lose his 10-year-old son Mark Hayden in the April 19 shooting, told CNN that Pugh had filed for divorce on grounds of infidelity. Brown described Elkins as clearly struggling in the months before the shooting. He said that after the divorce conversations began, Elkins seemed to be losing his footing. Betty Walker told the New York Times that the tensions in the relationship were tied not only to accusations of infidelity, but also to financial problems, to the accumulated pressure of a household supporting multiple children across 2 addresses, and to whatever was happening internally in a man who had never deployed, who had served 7 years in the Guard and separated at the lowest enlisted rank, who was driving a UPS route through the same city where he had grown up without his mother, and where he was now watching the family he had built begin to disassemble. The research on the relationship between domestic violence and separation is consistent enough that it has produced a specific category in the literature on intimate partner homicide, the period when a partner has announced an intention to leave, or when legal proceedings have formalized that intention, is consistently identified as the most dangerous interval in the entire arc of an abusive relationship. The danger is not evenly distributed across that interval. It concentrates. It concentrates when the separating partner has begun to establish independent housing. It concentrates when custody arrangements are being adjudicated and control over the children is being formally divided. It concentrates when the person who has been exercising control over the household begins to understand, concretely and legally, that the control is ending. A court date scheduled for April 20th, 2026, to formalize the separation between Elkins and Pugh sat directly inside that interval. The research says so clearly. The research has been saying so for decades. After the February suicide attempt, Elkins went to the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Shreveport for a mental health evaluation. The VA system for veterans in Shreveport is part of the broader network of VA medical centers and outpatient clinics that serve the veteran population of Northwest Louisiana and the surrounding region. Crystal Brown Page, a cousin of Troy Brown's, told CNN and the Washington Post that Elkins was admitted for evaluation and stayed approximately a week and a half before being discharged. Walker visited him during the stay. Pugh was there with him. He would not speak to Walker about what had brought him in. The details of his assessment, his diagnosis if any was made, the specific treatment plan that accompanied his discharge, the follow-up appointments if any were scheduled, and the criteria by which the hospital determined he was ready to leave are not part of the public record. Medical privacy protections mean they are unlikely to become part of the public record. What is part of the public record is that he went in, and that he stayed about 10 days, and that he came out. Troy Brown said that when Elkins came home from the VA, he seemed happy. Brown used that word directly in interviews given to CNN after the shooting. He came home happy. He loved his kids. He and Brown would take the children to the park and go out to eat and sit on the porch. Brown said he made a habit in those weeks of finding reasons to keep Elkins occupied and present. He would suggest dominoes, cards, walks. He was, by his own account, keeping a watch that he could not name as a watch, because doing so would have required acknowledging something he was not ready to acknowledge about what he was seeing. At some point during this period, Brown asked Elkins directly whether he needed to go back to the hospital. Elkins said he was fine. He said in the account Brown gave to reporters that he was just going to deal with it. That phrase, "I am just going to deal with it," is one of the most ordinary things a person in emotional difficulty can say, and one of the most difficult to respond to usefully without a formal clinical framework supporting the conversation. Brown was not a mental health professional. He was a brother-in-law who lived in the same house and loved the man he was worried about, and was trying to hold him together with the tools available to him, which were company and games and food and concern expressed through proximity. Those tools are not nothing. They are, in many cases, what keeps people alive through difficult periods. but they are not a substitute for the kind of structured, ongoing clinical support that the research on suicide and homicide prevention suggests is essential in the weeks and months after a first attempt, particularly when the precipitating stressors, in this case the divorce, the custody threat, and the financial pressure, have not been resolved. The VA system discharged Elkins after a week and a half. The system that had trained him to use weapons, that had accepted 7 years of his service, that was the institution with formal responsibility for his mental health as a veteran, assessed him and determined he was safe to go home. Shreveport Police Chief Wayne Smith confirmed after the shooting that Elkins's name was in the department's system prior to the weekend massacre. He did not elaborate on the nature or extent of that prior contact. The police department said it had not been aware of prior domestic violence issues at the household. Between the VA discharge and the morning of April 19th, roughly 2 months passed. In those 2 months, the divorce moved toward its April 20 court date. The relationship between Elkins and Pugh continued to deteriorate, and Elkins continued to move through his days in a way that, to most of the people who saw him, looked like a man managing. Easter Sunday was April 5, 2026. Elkins took all 7 of his children to church. This was, by his own description in the Facebook post he shared that afternoon, the first time he had done so. The photograph shows him surrounded by the children, all of them dressed for the occasion. He wrote that it had been a wonderful time and a blessed day. The post is genuinely affecting, in the way that photographs of children dressed for Easter are always affecting, regardless of what surrounds them. It is also the same day on which he called his biological mother, Mahalia, at her home and spoke with his stepfather, Marcus Jackson. In that phone call, Elkins told Jackson that he was drowning in dark thoughts. He said he was having thoughts of suicide. He said his wife wanted a divorce. Jackson tried to steady him, telling him that he could push past it, that difficulty could be overcome with strength. What Elkins said before he ended the call was that some people do not come back from their demons. Then he hung up. The call ended there. 4 days after Easter, on April 9th, Elkins posted to Facebook a prayer that he had reposted from another page. The post began by asking God to help guard his mind and his emotions. It asked for the awareness to recognize depression when it settled in and the strength to reject it. It named anxiety and panic alongside depression and asked for the ability to identify when those things were present and to turn them away. It ended with an appeal to the name of Jesus. The post, read after the fact, is one of those documents that the coverage of violent events often produces, a piece of ordinary expression that becomes evidence only in retrospect, that reads differently on April 21 than it would have read on April 9th to anyone who had scrolled past it without premonition. April 9th, 2026, was also the second anniversary of Elkins's marriage to Shaniqua Pugh. They had married on April 9th, 2024. The court date to dissolve that marriage was 11 days away. Brown continued to watch him. He kept asking him to come outside, to play dominoes, to take walks. He told CNN that Elkins loved his wife, loved the children, seemed unable to absorb what was happening to his household. His brother, speaking separately to reporters, said Elkins had told him directly in those weeks that he did not want to lose his wife. His exact words, as his brother reported them, were an appeal, a statement of not wanting rather than a threat, which is one of the reasons it was received as grief rather than danger. Grief and danger can look identical at a distance. They can look identical up close, too, in a person who has not yet converted one into the other and who may never do so. The difficulty is that there is no reliable way, in an informal family setting without clinical tools or legal authority, to determine which one is operating on a given afternoon when a man says he does not want to lose his wife and then goes back inside. Betty Walker, who had raised him, knew about the 2023 threat. She had told reporters afterward that she had ultimately taken Elkins at his word when he said he was just playing. The research on threats of this kind, the kind that name the children alongside the partner alongside the speaker's own death, does not support the interpretation that they are playing. Walker said she had not known, had not thought, that he would actually follow through. That is a sentence that belongs to nearly every account of familicide that has ever been investigated and reported. The people who knew the person afterward describe a version of the threat that they had filed under upset rather than plan. The plan and the threat had looked the same until the morning they stopped looking the same. between the Easter Sunday phone call, with its declaration about demons, and the morning of April 19, there were 14 days. During those 14 days, Elkins went to work at UPS. He took his daughter for what he called a one-on-one date and photographed her eating a burger and posted it to Facebook the Saturday before the shooting. He drove to Bossier City the day before to return a hat to a man he called Uncle. He came back across the Red River. He went home to the house on West 79th Street, where his children were going to sleep, where his wife was already moving toward the door, where the court date was the next morning. He had carried something for months that the people around him could see but not fully name. They had played dominoes with it and walked alongside it and asked it whether it needed to go back to the hospital. They had loved it and watched it post prayers to Facebook and take children to church and eat burgers with daughters in parked cars. They had done everything the informal architecture of family love can do, which is a great deal, and which was, in this case, not enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The February suicide attempt, the VA discharge, the Easter phone call, and the prayer posted to Facebook 10 days before the shooting form a sequence of signs that were visible but not formally connected. Next, the gun, where it came from, who supplied it, and what the federal investigation found when it began tracing the weapon that Shamar Elkins carried into the houses on West 79th Street. Section 5. The gun. On March 9, 2026, a man named Charles Ford opened the door of his truck and noticed that a firearm he had been keeping under the seat was no longer there. He knew immediately that he should not have had it at all. He was 56 years old, a Shreveport resident with a criminal record that included a 2000 conviction for simple robbery, for which he had been sentenced to 7 years in prison, and a 2011 plea of guilty to domestic abuse battery. Both convictions made him a prohibited person under federal law, meaning the possession of any firearm was a federal offense regardless of how the weapon came to be in his hands, or how long it had been there. He had known this when a woman gave it to him to hold while she was in the hospital. He had kept it anyway. He kept it under the seat of his truck, which is where it had been until the day he reached for it and found it gone. Ford suspected Elkins. The gun, a Mossberg 715P, chambered in .22 long rifle caliber, had disappeared, and Elkins was one of the few people who ever rode in the truck with him. Ford confronted Elkins about the missing weapon. Elkins became argumentative, and Ford described the exchange to federal investigators with a phrase that would appear in a court affidavit and in news coverage and in public consciousness as a small, devastating summary of what happens when confrontation is allowed to substitute for action. Ford said Elkins became offensive, so Ford let it go. The gun stayed wherever Elkins had taken it. 6 weeks later, Elkins carried it into a house on the 300 block of West 79th Street in Shreveport's Cedar Grove neighborhood and used it to shoot 8 children. The Mossberg 715P is a rifle-style pistol. It is built on a platform that resembles an AR-style rifle in its appearance and its manual of operation, but is classified as a pistol under federal law because it lacks a rifle stock. The .22 long rifle cartridge it fires is one of the most common cartridges in American shooting, used in recreational target shooting and small game hunting, generally regarded as lower-powered relative to centerfire rifle calibers. That characterization of relative power did not affect the outcome in the houses on West 79th Street in any meaningful way. The weapon fired the rounds that killed the children. The ATF photograph released as part of the federal court filing shows the gun in its recovered state, a short-barreled black firearm with the angular geometry associated in the public mind with military-style rifles. It is the kind of image that circulates in the aftermath of mass shootings and that produces in many observers a particular kind of exhaustion, the recognition of a familiar shape in a familiar context. The ATF firearms trace that produced Charles Ford's arrest began on April 20th, 2026, the morning after the shooting. ATF Special Agent Christina Curtis led the investigation into the weapon's provenance, working alongside the Shreveport Police Department. The trace process, which the ATF conducts for law enforcement agencies following crimes involving firearms, works backward through the commercial record of a weapon's life. Every gun sold by a federally licensed dealer must be recorded. The record links the weapon's serial number to the dealer who sold it, and from there to the first retail purchaser. After that first sale, the commercial trail may become informal or invisible, as guns move between private parties through gifts, loans, sales, and thefts that are not necessarily documented. The trace finds the origin. What happens after the origin is the harder part. The Mossberg 715P, used on April 19, had been purchased legitimately on February 22, 2025, by a woman whose name was not released in the public court documents. She was the legal first purchaser. The purchase went through a licensed dealer and would have involved a background check, as federal law requires. At some point after the purchase, the woman was hospitalized. While she was in the hospital, she gave the gun to Ford to hold. The mechanics of that transaction, whether she drove it to him or he collected it, whether it was a long conversation or a brief practical arrangement, are not established in the public record. What is established is that a woman who had legally bought a firearm gave it for safekeeping to a man who was legally prohibited from possessing one. Whether she knew of his prohibition is not addressed in the documents that have been made public. Ford held the gun under the seat of his truck from that point until March 9, 2026, when it disappeared. His criminal history and the fact that he knew he was prohibited from firearm possession shaped his response to the theft in a way that made any formal report to law enforcement impossible without incriminating himself. A prohibited person who has been keeping a firearm under his truck seat cannot call the police to report it stolen without disclosing that he had it. The informal route was to confront the person he suspected. He confronted Elkins. Elkins became offensive and Ford let it go. This is the logic of the informal gun economy, operating as it tends to operate, which is to say badly, for everyone, at every step, with consequences that accumulate invisibly until the morning they do not. When ATF agents first interviewed Ford on April 20, 2026, the day after the shooting, he denied ever possessing the weapon. He cited his own criminal history in doing so, acknowledging to investigators that he was not legally permitted to own a firearm and using that fact as a kind of preemptive shield, as though the acknowledgement of the prohibition established that he could not have violated it. It does not work that way, and investigators knew it did not work that way. In a second interview, Ford changed his account. He admitted that the woman had given him the Mossberg while she was in the hospital. He admitted he had kept it under the seat of his truck. He said he had noticed it missing around March 9, and that he believed Elkins had taken it because Elkins was one of the few people he gave rides to. He said he had confronted Elkins and that Elkins had become offensive, and so he had let it go. He said he had not reported the theft. The United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Louisiana charged Ford on April 21, 2026, 2 days after the shooting, with 2 federal offenses: being a felon in possession of a firearm and making false statements to federal agents. The felon in possession charge carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. The false statement charge carries a maximum of 5 years. Ford appeared in federal court on April 21 and was appointed a public defender. A grand jury formally indicted him on May 8, 2026. He pleaded not guilty. U.S. Attorney Zachary Keller issued a statement at the time of the arrest that acknowledged directly what the charges could and could not accomplish. Elkins's death, Keller said, meant that the community would never see him face justice in a courtroom. The prosecution of Ford represented the only remaining avenue for formal legal accountability in connection with how the weapon entered Elkins' possession. Keller stated that holding the person whose gun Elkins used to carry out the crime accountable was intended to provide some measure of solace to the Shreveport community. Whether charges against a man for possessing a firearm he should not have had, and then losing it to a theft he did not report, can provide solace to a community in which 8 children were shot is a question that the law, as a formal instrument, cannot entirely answer. The charges were the mechanism available. The mechanism was used. Elkins's own relationship to the weapon revealed a second layer of legal prohibition running beneath Ford's. Under Louisiana state law, Elkins's 2019 conviction for illegal use of weapons carried a minimum 10-year ban on firearm possession. Under federal law, the structure of the plea he had entered in Caddo District Court in October 2019 created ambiguity about whether the conviction triggered the federal prohibition on firearm ownership, an ambiguity that the ATF's post-shooting investigation had to navigate in reconstructing the chain of possession. What the investigation established clearly was that both of the men connected to the weapon, the man who kept it under his truck seat and the man who is believed to have taken it, were prohibited from possessing it. 2 prohibited persons, 1 stolen gun, 6 weeks of unrecorded movement, and then the morning of April 19. Troy Brown, Elkins' brother-in-law, told CNN that he had no idea there was a gun in the house. He said that if he had known, he would have gotten rid of it. Brown's son Marcaden was 10 years old and was at the West 79th Street house on the night of April 18, 2026, because it was his home. He had gone to sleep, presumably without knowing what was in the house either. The question of where the Mossberg was kept between March 9 and April 19 is not answered in the public record. It was somewhere in the domestic space of the West 79th Street household, or on Elkins' person, or in his vehicle, for the roughly 6 weeks between when Ford noticed it missing and when police recovered it in Bossier City after the shooting. No one in the household who was not Elkins appears to have known it was there. This is one of the consistent features of domestic firearm violence that makes it so difficult to intercept through standard law enforcement tools. The weapon is typically already inside the household before the danger it represents is formally recognized. Background check systems operate at the point of commercial purchase. They do not operate in the informal space where stolen guns move between people who cannot legally own them. The Louisville Courier-Journal and other outlets have documented across years of reporting that a substantial proportion of guns used in homicides were obtained outside the licensed commercial system, through theft, private sale, or informal transfer of exactly the kind that connected Ford and Elkins. The gun that entered the house on West 79th Street had passed through at least 3 sets of hands before it got there: a licensed purchaser, a prohibited person who accepted it as a favor, and a man who took it without permission and then became argumentative when asked to return it. Ford's 2011 domestic abuse battery conviction sits in the record without fanfare but with its own significance. A man prohibited from firearm possession not only for robbery but for domestic violence held a gun under his truck seat for approximately a year. A man who had threatened his wife and children held a gun that another prohibited person chose not to report stolen, because reporting it would have exposed his own violation. The specific contours of this chain of events were not inevitable. They were, at several points, the product of choices, each of which individually seemed manageable, and each of which, looked at together, produced the Mossberg 715P arriving at West 79th Street on April 19, 2026, in the hands of someone who should never have been able to obtain it. The ATF investigation confirmed what the firearms trace had suggested from the beginning. The gun's path from its original legal sale in February 2025 to its use in the shooting 14 months later passed entirely outside the formal systems designed to keep weapons away from prohibited persons. Those systems operate on the assumption that commercial transactions are the primary mechanism through which guns reach dangerous hands. The assumption is regularly confounded by exactly the kind of informal movement that characterized this weapon's history. The FBI offered assistance with the investigation. The ATF continued its inquiry into the full circumstances of the transfer. The federal prosecution of Charles Ford moved through the courts. And the question that all of it circled without fully answering: how a man who was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm came to possess the weapon that killed 8 children, received the answer that this kind of investigation almost always produces. Through a chain of decisions, none of them made in a courtroom, each of them made in the informal spaces where law does not reach until it is too late. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Mossberg traced from a legal purchase through a convicted felon's truck seat to a man who should never have been able to hold it, and then into a house where children were sleeping. Next, the final 18 hours before the shooting, the Saturday afternoon visit Elkins made across the Red River to Bossier City, and what he said and did in the hours before the morning of April 19th. Section 6. The last 18 hours, crossing the Red River from Shreveport into Bossier City, takes roughly 4 minutes by car. The bridge carries traffic east over the water that divides the two cities, and Bossier City sits on the other side, as the smaller, quieter counterpart to its larger neighbor. About 15 miles of road separating the Cedar Grove neighborhood of South Shreveport from the residential streets of North Bossier City, where a man named Michael Mayence lived on Brompton Lane. Elkins had made that crossing many times. He had made it the afternoon of Saturday, April 18, 2026, driving east with Shanchiqua Pugh beside him to visit the man he called Uncle, and he would make it again in the early hours of the following morning, this time alone, in a red Kia Sportage he had taken at gunpoint from someone standing near the intersection of West 79th Street and Linwood Avenue, with police already in pursuit behind him. The Saturday visit, the one with Pugh in the car, was not unusual in its surface appearance. Elkins had known Michael Mayance for most of his life. Mayance was an Iraq War veteran and former Louisiana Army National Guard member who had, by his own account posted to Facebook afterward, known Elkins since he was a small boy, helped raise him after his biological father was absent from the household, and described him as a former young soldier of his. The relationship between them ran across most of the decades of Elkins's life, from childhood through the years of Guard service, and had continued into the adult friendship of men who called each other family without sharing blood. Elkins called him Uncle. He meant it in the way that people mean it when the word names something real and long, rather than a formal biological category. During the Guard years, Mayance had given Elkins a captain's hat. It was the kind of object that carries weight not because of what it is materially, but because of what it represents. A transfer from a senior to a junior that functions as recognition, as belonging. Elkins had kept the hat. On the Saturday afternoon of April 18th, he brought it back. He returned it during the visit, and it stayed with Mayance when Elkins left. Michael Mayance's brother Robert, speaking to reporters in the days after the shooting, said that looking back, you could draw conclusions from that act. He noted the observation that when people begin returning prized possessions, it can be a sign of what they are planning. He was talking about his own capacity to read the gesture in retrospect, which is a different thing entirely from what it would have taken to read it in the room on Saturday afternoon. The three of them, Elkins, Pugh, and Mayance, sat down during the visit and talked. The conversation turned to the marriage that was ending. The court date was 2 days away. Whatever had been said on that Saturday in Bossier City, whatever Elkins conveyed to the man he trusted enough to call Uncle, was not enough to change what happened the following morning. Mayance had also spoken with him the day before the Saturday visit, according to his own Facebook account posted in the days after the shooting, describing conversations about Elkins's personal struggles and the possible divorce. When Elkins left Brompton Lane on Saturday afternoon, the hat stayed behind on a shelf or a counter in the house, and Elkins drove back across the Red River into Shreveport. Late on Saturday, he took his eldest daughter somewhere and photographed her eating a burger in the front seat of a car. He posted the image to Facebook. His caption described it as a one-on-one date with his oldest. It was the last post he made. The daughter in the photograph is one of the children who died the following morning. She was, in the image, eating and alive and sitting close enough to her father that he could photograph her clearly from the driver's seat. The image, like the Easter photograph from 2 weeks earlier, resolves into evidence only in retrospect. On Saturday evening, it was a father and his daughter eating fast food, which is an ordinary thing, and which was. Michele Silva, Michael Mayance's sister, had known Elkins since he was 6 years old, more than 25 years. She told a television reporter in the days after the shooting that she would never in a million years have believed he could do anything like this to himself or to anyone else. She said she was aware that Elkins and his wife were possibly divorcing and that he did not want to be divorced. That is the sum of what the people closest to the situation, the ones with the longest view of him, were holding as Saturday night moved into Sunday morning. An unwanted divorce. A man who did not want to lose his family. Signs, looked at after the fact, that arranged themselves into a pattern nobody had assembled in time. At some point before 5:55 in the morning on April 19, 2026, Elkins left the house on West 79th Street with the Mossberg and went first to Harrison Street. The sequence of the two addresses is significant for what it suggests about intention and planning. Harrison Street was where Christina Snow lived, a block away, with 3 of his children. He walked to her door and knocked. When she opened it, he shot her in the face. He was shot 9 times, according to the Wikipedia account of the attack, which identifies Snow as having been shot 9 times rather than Elkins. Christina Snow survived because she was not at the West 79th Street address when Elkins completed his main attack. The evidence at the Harrison Street address suggests that Elkins had taken her 3 children from the house after shooting her, or had moved them separately, because police dispatch was told during the chase that children taken from the Harrison Street residence may have been inside the fleeing vehicle. Snow, shot and bleeding at her own front door, used Siri to call for help. The call connected. That call was received at 5:55 in the morning, according to the formal Shreveport Police Dispatch timeline, which makes the Harrison Street shooting the initiating event of the recorded sequence, the moment the clock started on the institutional response. The first call came from someone on the roof of the West 79th Street house, a caller later identified as Keosha Pugh, who said the suspect was inside and that a male had been shot. Subsequent calls in the minutes that followed identified Elkins by name, stated that he had shot everyone inside the house, and confirmed that Keosha and her children had fled onto the roof and then to the backyard. What had happened inside the house between whatever time Elkins entered it and the first call at 5:55 can be established only in its outcome. The 8 children were shot. The Shreveport Police Department's own spokesperson, Corporal Chris Bordelon, said at a press conference on Sunday that many of the children appeared to have been shot in the head while they slept. He used the word disgusting. He used the word evil. He was standing outside a house he had just come out of, and he could not stay with the measured language of his professional function. One child was found dead on the roof, having been shot while trying to escape through a window. Shaniqua Pugh was shot in the face and survived. Keosha Pugh, Shaniqua's sister, jumped from the roof with her 12-year-old daughter. Keosha broke bones in the fall. Her daughter sustained only scratches. Her 10-year-old son, Marcaden, who was in the house, did not escape. He was among the 8 who died. Police arrived at Harrison Street at 6 minutes past 6 and received the second call about West 79th Street at 6:07. By 6:08, Elkins had been identified by name as the suspect across the linked incidents. At 6:15, dispatch received information that Elkins had committed a carjacking at the corner of West 79th Street and Linwood Avenue, taking a red Kia Sportage at gunpoint. Traffic units spotted the vehicle at 6:17. By 6:29, officers had confronted Elkins. At 6:43, police located the victims at the West 79th Street address. The distance between the first call and the moment officers found the children inside the house spans less than an hour from the beginning to the worst of it. The red Kia Sportage traveled east. It went south on Interstate 49 and then across the Red River Bridge into Bossier City, with Shreveport police in pursuit behind it. There was a moment during the chase when dispatch circulated information that children taken from the Harrison Street residence might be inside the fleeing vehicle, which changed the pursuit calculus for the officers involved. The chase extended roughly 15 miles from the Cedar Grove neighborhood before ending in the 400 block of Brompton Lane in North Bossier City. The address on Brompton Lane was Michael Mayance's home. Mayance wrote on Facebook afterward that he had been asleep when his security cameras activated because there was activity at his doorway. His nephew, who lived with him, had answered the door. By the time Mayance reached the entry, Elkins was standing there. Mayance wrote that he had recognized Elkins's voice before he saw him. He wrote that he believed Elkins had come to his doorstep looking for the safety that he had always had in Mayance, the adopted uncle, the trusted officer. Elkins was carrying the Mossberg, the same weapon that had been in Ford's truck and then in the West 79th Street house was in his hands on a doorstep in Bossier City at approximately 6:30 on a Sunday morning. Mayance and Elkins spoke for less than a minute. According to Mayance's account, Elkins confessed. He told Mayance what he had done to the children inside the house across the river. Then he put the barrel of the gun to his own mouth and fired. Mayance told reporters that when Elkins fired, the officers outside opened fire in response, having been unable from their position to determine whether the shot was directed at Mayance or at them. Mayance described getting glass in his arm from secondary effects of the exchange. The preliminary autopsy finding, released in the days after the shooting, determined that Elkins died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was pronounced dead at 7:03 in the morning, 68 minutes after the first emergency call had come in from Harrison Street. Louisiana State Police took over the investigation into the circumstances of Elkins's death, as standard protocol requires when an officer-involved shooting occurs, regardless of whether the deceased also fired on himself. The search of Michael Mayance's home on Brompton Lane that followed the scene being made safe produced a finding that expanded the federal investigation into a third named defendant. Inside the house, law enforcement found multiple firearms, 4 weapons in total, according to the federal filing that followed. A check of Mayance's criminal history revealed that he had been subject to an active domestic violence protection order since October 2024. The order had been formally served on Mayance in December 2024 and was scheduled to remain in effect until May 2026. A person subject to a domestic violence protection order is prohibited from possessing firearms under federal law. The prohibition had been in place for more than 4 months at the time of Elkins's arrival. Mayance had 4 guns in the house. The United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Louisiana charged Michael Mayance on April 23, 2026, 4 days after the shooting, with possessing a firearm while subject to a domestic violence injunction. He faces up to 15 years in federal prison. A federal grand jury indicted him in the same week that Charles Ford was indicted, in the first week of May 2026. ATF Special Agent in Charge Joshua Jackson, speaking publicly about the Mayance charges, said that Mayance was an Iraq War veteran and former Louisiana National Guard member who had a relationship with Elkins spanning years, and that through the course of the investigation and conversations with Mayance, investigators found that Mayance appeared to be agreeable with Elkins and the actions he had taken. That is a careful formulation, and its full implication is not spelled out in the public record. It is not the same as saying Mayance knew in advance. It says something narrower and more difficult, which is that in the conversation in the doorway, in the dark, in the 60 seconds before Elkins died, the response Mayance gave was one that investigators characterized as agreeable rather than horrified. Robert Mayance, speaking on his brother's behalf, said Michael had been startled awake by the cameras and had no warning Elkins was coming. Michael Mayance had spent the Saturday with him, had heard about the marriage, had received the captain's hat that Elkins had kept for years, and was now returning. He had known the man since he was a small boy, and he had watched him grow up into a father who posted Easter photographs and took daughters for one-on-one dates, and then, on a Sunday morning before the city was awake, drove a stolen car to his doorstep, carrying a weapon, and said what he had done. The conversation lasted under a minute. Some people do not come back from their demons. Elkins had said that on Easter Sunday. 14 days later, on the doorstep of the man he had called uncle his entire adult life, he confirmed it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 18 hours before the shooting moved from a Saturday visit to a man Elkins called Uncle, through the return of a captain's hat he had held for years, to a Sunday morning in Cedar Grove, and a doorstep in Bossier City where it ended. Next, what the investigation found afterward, the federal charges, the federal grand jury, and the question of how 3 people connected to this case, including the man who raised Elkins in spirit, if not in blood, all came to be prohibited from owning firearms, and none of them were stopped. Section 7. The chain before the bodies in the house on West 79th Street had been formally processed by the Caddo Parish Coroner's Office, before the vigil candles had been lit on Monday evening in Cedar Grove, before the press conferences and the congressional statements and the national media cycle had fully assembled itself around what had happened in Shreveport on a Sunday morning. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives had already begun working backward from the Mossberg 715P. The firearms trace started on April 20th, 2026, the day after the shooting. It is a process built for exactly this kind of situation, and the ATF conducts hundreds of thousands of them every year, each one beginning with a serial number and ending somewhere in the record of human transactions that connected a gun to the moment it was used. This one ended with 3 men, all of them prohibited from possessing firearms under federal or state law, all of them connected to the same weapon through a chain of informal transfers and stolen goods, and decisions not to report. The tracing took less than 48 hours to produce its first arrest. The investigation expanded outward from the gun in the way that federal firearms investigations tend to, which is methodically and with a narrow initial focus that widens as each link in the chain produces a new name. The ATF interviewed the original purchaser of the Mossberg, a woman who had bought the weapon legitimately from a licensed dealer on February 22, 2025. She identified Ford. ATF agents contacted Ford on April 20. He denied possessing the gun, citing his own criminal record as evidence that he could not have had it, a formulation that misunderstands, perhaps deliberately, the difference between being prohibited and being incapable. In a second interview, he changed his account. He described the arrangement with the woman who had given him the gun while she was in the hospital. He said he had kept it under the truck seat. He said Elkins was one of the few people he gave rides to. He said he suspected Elkins had taken it around March 9, and that when he confronted Elkins about the theft, Elkins became offensive. He said he let it go. On April 21, 2 days after the shooting, the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Louisiana charged Charles Ford with 2 federal offenses. The first was being a felon in possession of a firearm, which carries a maximum sentence of 15 years. The second was making false statements to federal agents, which carries a maximum of 5 years. U.S. Attorney Zachary Keller said at a press conference that words fell short in describing what Elkins had done in Shreveport, and made clear that Ford was not being charged as an accessory to the murders of the 8 children. The charges were for what Ford had done, not for what Elkins had done with the thing Ford possessed. The distinction is legally important and morally unsatisfying in roughly equal measure. Corporal Chris Bordelon of the Shreveport Police Department, speaking on the same day, framed the investigation's expansion in terms of institutional determination rather than legal technicality. He said the case opened up all the tools available and gave investigators more factors to work with in identifying the individuals who helped purchase the gun, who helped transfer it, and who put it in Elkins's hands. He said the department was going to hold them accountable and put them in prison. The language was direct and public and reflected the frustration of an institution that had been unable to prevent what happened and was now focused on the narrower question of what could be prosecuted in its aftermath. ATF Special Agent in Charge Joshua Jackson made a statement that went somewhat further in articulating the philosophy behind the expansion of the investigation. He said that holding people accountable does not stop with the person who pulled the trigger, but includes those who give access to and proliferate firearms that are later used in violent crime. That framing positions the Ford prosecution not merely as a response to one specific case, but as a demonstration of a broader enforcement principle. The informal gun economy that allows firearms to move between prohibited persons through theft, informal transfer, and arrangements made in hospital rooms and truck cabs is not a phenomenon unique to Shreveport or to this case. It is, by most estimates drawn from law enforcement data, the primary mechanism through which guns reach people who are legally prohibited from possessing them. The ATF traces firearms. The traces produce prosecutions. The prosecutions are intended to deter the informal transfers that make the tracing necessary in the first place. Whether they do is a question the research on deterrence and illegal gun markets has not resolved with any consistency. Ford appeared in federal court on May 13, 2026, after a grand jury formally indicted him on May 8. He pleaded not guilty to both charges. A court-appointed public defender represented him. A detention hearing was held on May 18th, at which U.S. Magistrate Judge Mark Hornsby ruled that no conditions of release could reasonably assure the safety of the community, and ordered Ford remanded to the custody of the U.S. Marshal's Office. He remained in federal custody through the subsequent weeks of the case. On June 15, 2026, during a scheduled court hearing, Ford changed his plea to guilty. The reversal of a not guilty plea to guilty is standard in the trajectory of federal prosecutions, which produce guilty pleas in the large majority of cases that do not end in dismissal. Ford's sentencing was scheduled for October 12, 2026. The charges he pleaded guilty to do not carry mandatory minimum sentences, which means the sentencing judge has discretion within the range set by the guidelines. What that discretion produces in October remains, at the time the investigation stands, unknown. 2 days after Ford was charged, on April 23rd, the same federal office charged Michael Mayence. The charging document identified him as a 54-year-old Shreveport resident and described the legal basis for the charge: possession of a firearm while being subject to a domestic violence injunction. The injunction had been in place since October 2024, formally served on Mayence in December 2024, and scheduled to remain active until May 2026. He had been under that order for more than 4 months on the night of April 18, when Elkins drove to Bossier City to return the captain's hat, and he had 4 guns in the house on Brompton Lane throughout that period. Federal law on this point is not ambiguous. A person subject to a qualifying domestic violence protection order is prohibited from possessing firearms. The law was passed specifically because the research on intimate partner homicide identified the period of a domestic dispute, including the period covered by a court order, as one of the most dangerous intervals in the relationship. Mayence was under an order that existed because of that research and that legal recognition, and he had 4 guns in his house. The U.S. Attorney's statement on the Mayence charge contained language that went beyond the formal legal description of the offense. Keller said that Elkins's crimes had shined a bright light on the danger that domestic violence presents, and that the fact that Elkins fled to the home of a man who himself illegally possessed firearms while being subject to a domestic violence order reflected the need to deter the illegal conduct. The observation embedded in that statement is worth holding. Elkins committed familicide and then drove to a man he trusted. That man had a domestic violence court order against him and 4 firearms in his residence. The connection between the two is not coincidental in any structural sense. Both men existed inside a network of relationships in which domestic violence was documented and in which the legal prohibitions that followed from that documentation had not translated into the removal of access to weapons. ATF Special Agent in Charge Jackson made a statement about the Mayence investigation that introduced a dimension beyond the simple illegal possession charge. He said that investigators knew Mayence and Elkins had a relationship and a friendship, and that through the course of the investigation and conversations with Mayence appeared to also be agreeable with Elkins and the actions he had taken. The word agreeable is one of the more carefully chosen words in the public record of this case. It does not say complicit. It does not say approving. It says agreeable, which in the context of an investigator describing a conversation means something narrower and more specific than a general moral characterization. It means that in what Mayence said to investigators about what Elkins had said in the under-a-minute conversation at the doorstep, the responses Mayence described giving did not appear to be expressions of shock or opposition. The full content of that doorstep conversation, and what exactly was exchanged in the seconds before Elkins fired, has not been established in the public record with any more precision than what Mayence himself wrote on Facebook and what Robert Mayence said to reporters on his brother's behalf. A federal grand jury indicted Mayence on the same day it indicted Ford, on May 7, 2026. Mayence pleaded not guilty. As of July 2026, his case remained in federal court with scheduling proceedings underway. The July 14, 2026 reporting from CASELA confirmed that court dates had been set for both Ford and Mayence as the cases moved through the pretrial process. The investigation that produced those 2 indictments also produced the clearest picture available of how the Mossberg 715P traveled from a licensed purchase in February 2025 to the house on West 79th Street in April 2026, a journey that passed through at least 2 prohibited persons before it arrived in the hands of a third. What the investigation also produced, as a byproduct of the firearms trace and the expanding scope of federal attention on the case, was a demonstration of something that the policy literature on illegal gun markets has documented consistently and that public debate about firearms tends to underemphasize. The prohibited person system, which is the primary federal mechanism for keeping guns away from people with violent or domestic violence records, is not a barrier. It is a filter. It reduces the ease with which prohibited persons can obtain weapons through licensed commercial channels, where background checks are required. It does not reduce, in any meaningful measured way, the availability of weapons to prohibited persons through the informal channels of theft, private transfer, and the kind of arrangement made between Ford and the woman who gave him the Mossberg while she was in the hospital. Those informal channels exist independently of the background check system and operate in the space between transactions that are recorded and transactions that are not. All 3 men at the center of the weapons investigation had records that should, under any reading of the policy, have resulted in their being identified as people for whom firearm access was particularly dangerous. Elkins had a 2019 weapons conviction for firing rounds near a school. Ford had a 2000 robbery conviction and a 2011 domestic abuse battery plea. Mayence was operating under an active domestic violence court order at the time of the shooting. The system that produces prohibited persons lists, background checks, and court orders had correctly identified all three of them as prohibited. What it had not done, and what it is structurally not designed to do, is locate and remove the firearms that those people already possessed or could access informally. The gun that killed 8 children on West 79th Street was not purchased by Elkins. It was not purchased by Ford. It was purchased legally by someone else, given to a prohibited person for safekeeping, and then taken by another prohibited person who became offensive when asked to return it. The investigation made 2 arrests, produced 2 guilty pleas or charges, and established the evidentiary record of the weapon's movement. What it could not do, and what no investigation into the aftermath of an event like this can do, is answer the question that the people who lost children to that event are left asking. The federal prosecution of Charles Ford will produce a sentence in October 2026. The prosecution of Michael Mayance will produce its own outcome through the court process. Those outcomes are the institutional response available within the legal framework that governs what happened. They are not, and cannot be, commensurate with what happened. The law acknowledges this implicitly when U.S. Attorney Keller says that some solace might come from accountability. Solace and justice are not the same thing, and accountability measured in years of federal sentencing is not the same as the return of 8 children from Cedar Grove. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 3 prohibited persons, 1 weapon, and a federal investigation that moved from firearms trace to grand jury in under 3 weeks. Next, the city of Shreveport itself, the public response to the shooting, the political arguments that followed, and what happened to the Domestic Violence Resource Center that the City Council had voted to abandon just weeks before 8 children died. Section 8. The city responds. Stuffed animals arrived first. Before the candlelight vigil, before the press conferences had finished, before the coroner's office had released the names, people were placing them at the door of the house on West 79th Street. Flowers, too, and handwritten notes, and photographs of children who were still alive in the photographs. The Cedar Grove neighborhood on the afternoon of April 19 was full of people who had nowhere specific to go and needed to be somewhere close to what had happened, so they came to the street where it happened and stood. A woman arrived carrying a stuffed unicorn. Others wept in groups on the sidewalk. Mayor Tom Arsenault walked among them, speaking and listening in the way that mayors do when a city has produced something so extreme that the only honest institutional response is physical presence rather than policy. That Sunday evening, a candlelight vigil formed near the 2 houses. The city had not organized it. The neighborhood did. Hundreds of people held candles on a Sunday evening in April in the southern half of Shreveport and stood together in the particular silence of grief that does not yet have language adequate to it. The following Monday evening, another gathering formed. City Councilman Alan Jackson attended alongside Mayor Arsenault. Jackson addressed the crowd and made a direct appeal. He asked the community to put down the guns. He named specific intervals, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then stretched the ask to the full year. He received applause. Whether applause in response to an appeal about gun violence in a city where more than 30% of murders are domestic in nature constitutes a meaningful social compact is a question the weeks that followed began to answer, in complicated ways. On Wednesday, April 22nd, a third vigil gathered on Linwood Avenue, the street that intersects West 79th Street near the carjacking point. Hundreds came again. 8 crosses had been placed at the site, 1 for each child. One of the survivors of the shooting attended. The families released a joint statement through Shreveport's Director of Council Affairs, R.J. Johnson, who read it aloud as the candles burned. The statement said that the Snow, Elkins, and Pugh families had come together as one in grief, united by a loss that no family should ever have to endure. It described the children as deeply loved, full of life, a source of joy to everyone who knew them. It asked for continued prayers, respect, and privacy as the families navigated the days ahead and the long journey of healing. The phrase "long journey of healing" is the kind of phrase that public statements in situations like this reach for, and it was not wrong, but it was also not large enough to describe what 2 women who had lost 7 children between them would be navigating for the rest of their lives. Governor Jeff Landry announced on Monday that his family's foundation, Love One Louisiana, which had also supported families affected by the New Year's attack on Bourbon Street, would cover the funeral and burial expenses for all 8 children. The Community Foundation of North Louisiana, under CEO Christy Gustafson, established 2 separate funds, one to provide for the material needs of the surviving families, and one directed specifically toward domestic violence protection in the region. Governor Landry visited Shreveport in the days after the shooting and spoke at a press conference in terms that departed somewhat from the general register of political condolence. He said he could not place himself in the shoes of a father who could execute his children. He described the attack as systematic. He used that specific word. It was from one house to the other, he said. It was not a fit of rage when he snapped once. It was systematic. That distinction between a single outburst and a sequence of deliberate acts across 2 addresses against a specific list of people is one that the researchers who study family annihilation have drawn in their own literature. Landry was saying something clinically accurate without deploying clinical language. House Speaker Mike Johnson, who represents a district that includes Shreveport, issued a statement expressing heartbreak and praising the law enforcement response. U.S. Representative Cleo Fields addressed the crowd at the joint funeral on May 9th at Summer Grove Baptist Church and said that what Shreveport was experiencing was not a local mourning but a nationwide one. Hundreds attended the funeral, which was held on a Saturday in May, 20 days after the shooting. The children were buried together, as their mothers had requested. LaShun Berry, Christina Snow's aunt, had conveyed the request in the weeks before. Since they died together, the mothers wanted them buried together. Governor Landry ordered flags across Louisiana to fly at half-staff for 8 days beginning on May 9th, the day of the funeral, with each day dedicated to one of the 8 children. The specific gesture, 8 days for 8 children, was the kind of act that tries to give individual weight to deaths that the scale of the event tends to collapse into a single number. Between the funerals and the flags and the candlelight vigils, the harder political accounting was happening in a place less visible than the streets of Cedar Grove. It was happening in the record of what the Shreveport City Council had done on March 24, 2026, 26 days before the shooting. On that Tuesday evening, the council had voted to withdraw from a partnership with the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office that was intended to establish a domestic violence resource center at the new police substation on North Market Street. The center had been planned as part of a broader effort to create what officials described as a centralized hub for domestic violence victims, providing services in one location that could reduce the friction of accessing help in a city where more than 30% of murders were already documented as domestic in origin. The plan had been in development long enough to generate funding proposals and a specific dollar amount. The city was prepared to transfer $125,000 from the public safety budget to the sheriff's office to operate the center. What happened to that plan illustrates the particular difficulty of building domestic violence infrastructure in a city where the political will to address the problem exists alongside the institutional friction that prevents that will from translating into durable programs. The Northwest Louisiana Family Justice Center, which had been identified as a partner for the planned center, turned out not to be in a position to operate an expansion at the substation site. The facilities available were not large enough to function as a full center. The association that had been quietly working to salvage something from the plan, organizing computer donations and partnerships in anticipation of the council's approval, had done so without fully coordinating with the council, which was unaware of how far that preparation had gone or how limited it was. When the details came before the council, it became clear that what was being proposed was substantially smaller than what had been envisioned. Then the sheriff withdrew. Henry Whitehorn, the Caddo Parish Sheriff, pulled his office's participation before the vote. Councilwoman Tabitha Taylor described it afterward as a response to negative pushback, characterizing the sheriff's decision in the language of an institutional retreat under pressure from forces she did not specifically name. Councilman Grayson Boucher said that he unfortunately believed outside forces had gotten involved, which is a formulation that names a phenomenon without describing it. Whatever those forces were, the practical outcome was that on March 24th, 2 pieces of legislation that would have established the Domestic Violence Center and transferred the funding both failed to advance. The center did not open. Francis Washington, a domestic violence survivor who attended the council meeting and watched both measures fail, said she thought it was not a great decision and that she did not understand it. She said she felt those funds could have helped someone. She was right. 26 days later, 8 children were dead in Cedar Grove. The causal connection between the council's decision in March and the massacre in April is not direct, and stating it as a simple cause and effect relationship would misrepresent how institutional failures and individual acts of violence relate to each other. Elkins was not in the Domestic Violence Resource Center's target population in any formal sense, because the Shreveport Police Department's own records showed no prior domestic violence calls associated with his household. The center, had it existed, would not necessarily have intercepted him specifically, but the presence of a functioning, accessible domestic violence resource center in a city where over 30% of murders are domestic does not exist to address only the cases that are formally documented. It exists to reduce the overall burden of domestic violence in the city by providing the kind of early-stage intervention, victim support, and safety planning that shifts outcomes across the entire spectrum of domestic situations, including the ones that have not yet produced a police report. On April 29, 2026, 10 days after the shooting, the Shreveport City Council introduced a resolution to establish a domestic violence center at the North Shreveport Police Substation as a pilot program. The Northwest Louisiana Family Justice Center offered approximately 20 hours of weekly on-site coverage. Chief Administrative Officer Tom Dark described it as a joint effort between the city and the Family Justice Center. The pilot was designed to run through August 30, 2026. Councilman James Green said planning was underway for a domestic violence summit to be held within 30 days at First Methodist Church, and reported that people were calling from across the country expressing interest in participating. The council that had voted to abandon the partnership in March reconstituted a version of it in April, under the pressure that 8 dead children in Cedar Grove had applied to the political calculus of the question. The difference between the March vote and the April resolution is the difference between a decision made in the absence of public crisis and a decision made in its presence. The policy need had not changed between March 24th and April 29. The statistics had not changed. The city's documented domestic violence epidemic, the 30% figure that Boucher had been citing publicly for months, was the same figure before and after April 19. What changed was the visibility of the cost of failing to address it. That visibility is a brutal way for a city to be educated about what its own statistics mean. In the Louisiana legislature, the shooting accelerated the movement of 2 bills that had already been working through committee. Senate Bill 371, authored by Senator Mark Abraham of Lake Charles, proposed the creation of a habitual domestic violence offender registry, modeled on a similar registry that Tennessee had established through what that state called Savannah's Law, which took effect in January 2026. Abraham's bill specified that offenders with 2 or more convictions for qualifying domestic violence offenses would be entered into a publicly accessible database maintained by the Louisiana Bureau of Criminal Identification and Information. House Bill 86, proposed by Shreveport Representative Joy Walters, moved through the House with similar intent. Shreveport Police Chief Wayne Smith expressed public support for the registry concept, saying that if he were looking for a relationship, he would want to know whether a potential partner had a track record of domestic violence, and that such knowledge would send him in another direction. Louisiana would become, if the bills passed, only the 2nd state in the country to operate such a registry. The Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence offered a more cautious response. The coalition's executive director, Mariah Winiski, said the organization did not historically support public offender registries, citing concerns about unintended consequences. One concern was victim privacy, since identifying an offender publicly also tends to identify their victim. Another was the question of where moral responsibility for screening a potential partner ultimately rests, and whether a registry creates a framework in which survivors of undocumented abuse are implicitly blamed for not having consulted a database that would not have contained their abuser's name. The registry debate, like most debates about domestic violence policy, moved between the legitimate but competing needs of early warning, victim privacy, offender accountability, and the practical reality that most domestic violence does not leave a formal record until it has already escalated significantly. What neither bill, in any version that was publicly circulated, addressed was the specific situation that defined the Elkins case: a man with no formal domestic violence history who had threatened to kill his family in the presence of a witness who was not a mandated reporter, who had attempted to end his own life 2 months before the shooting, who had been discharged from VA care, who had expressed suicidal ideation to his stepfather 14 days before the attack, and whose name was in the police department's system for an unrelated weapons conviction. No registry would have captured him. No background check had been triggered by any of the warning signs that had accumulated since February. The gap he fell through was not a registry gap or a background check gap. It was a gap in the informal architecture of family and community, the space between knowing something is wrong and having a formal mechanism available to do something about it. Christina Snow, who lost all 3 of her children in the attack and who survived with a bullet permanently lodged in her face, had, according to her aunt LaShun Berry, no place to stay in the weeks after the shooting, and no financial support beyond what small assistance came from a handful of individual community members and local officials. Berry asked publicly how anyone could tell these families to return to homes where their children's blood remained on the walls. The question was not rhetorical, it was literal. Snow had been released from hospital and was navigating the wreckage of her life in a city that had candles and vigils and resolutions and pilot programs and legislative proposals, none of which were immediately relevant to the question of where she would sleep or how she would pay for it. The Community Foundation of North Louisiana had opened a fund. Whether that fund reached Christina Snow or in what amount is not part of the public record. The gap between institutional response and individual need is always present after events like this. In Shreveport in the spring of 2026, it was very visible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A city responded with candles, pilot programs, and proposed registries, while a survivor slept somewhere she would not talk about publicly and carried a bullet she could not have removed. Next, the broader pattern this case fits into. What the research on familicide says about how men like Shamar Elkins are identified before they act, and why the systems designed to identify them keep producing the same outcome. Section 9. What the research knew. 3 days before 8 children died in Cedar Grove, a different household in a different state produced a different version of the same outcome. On April 16, 2026, in Annandale, Virginia, a man named Justin Fairfax shot and killed his wife, Serena Fairfax, before turning the gun on himself. Fairfax had served as the 41st Lieutenant Governor of Virginia from 2018 to 2022. Serena Fairfax was a dentist, 49 years old. They had 2 teenage children who were in the house when it happened. The couple had separated in 2024, after nearly 2 decades of marriage, and divorce proceedings were ongoing. Fairfax had faced sexual assault allegations in 2019 that had ended his political career before it could advance further. Family members said the years after those allegations had been difficult for his mental health. He had purchased a handgun in 2022. The Fairfax County Police Chief described the killing as the product of a domestic dispute surrounding what appeared to be a complicated or messy divorce. The language the police chief used, complicated or messy divorce, was the same language that appears in police reports and media coverage of separation-related domestic violence across thousands of cases over decades of documentation. It describes the precipitating context as though the context were itself the cause, as though the complication of the divorce were what killed Serena Fairfax, rather than a man with a gun and a history of warning signs that had accumulated around him without producing a formal intervention. 3 days after the Fairfax killing, Shamar Elkins drove to Harrison Street and knocked on Christina Snow's door. The research on intimate partner homicide does not treat these events as coincidental in any structural sense. It treats them as examples of the same pattern, arriving in the same week, in 2 different states, at 2 different addresses, against women who were all, as a Time magazine analysis noted, black mothers. The research on familicide and intimate partner homicide is, by the standards of social science literature, unusually consistent in its findings. The 4 most dangerous warning signs for intimate partner homicide, identified repeatedly across studies examining thousands of cases, are firearm access, separation, prior non-fatal strangulation, and stalking. Each of those warning signs concentrates risk in a specific way. Firearm access is the most predictive single factor across nearly all models, because the presence of a gun in a domestic conflict changes the lethality of any single violent episode by an order of magnitude. Separation is the contextual frame inside which the risk created by the other factors activates most acutely, because separation, particularly when it involves custody of children, represents for controlling or coercively dominant partners the complete collapse of the mechanisms through which they have been exercising power over the household. Beyond those four primary factors, the research identifies additional risk flags that include unemployment, substance use, controlling or jealous behavior, abuse during pregnancy, prior threats involving weapons, and prior threats of suicide. That last factor, prior threats of suicide made in the context of a domestic relationship, is particularly relevant to both the Fairfax case and the Elkins case, and is one of the least publicly understood risk factors in the broader conversation about domestic violence. The suicide threat in a domestic context is not always, or even primarily, an expression of personal despair independent of the relationship. Research on what is sometimes called extended suicide, in which the perpetrator intends to die and also intends to take family members with them, shows consistently that the fusion of a threat against the self with a threat against family members is one of the most reliable markers of familicide risk. Elkins said it directly in 2023. He said he would kill Pugh, the kids, and himself. That triple construction, the partner, the children, and the self as a combined target of the perpetrator's final act, is documented in the academic literature on familicide as a characteristic signature of the category. Betty Walker heard it and chose to believe he was joking. The research suggests he was not. Catherine Spearman, an assistant professor at Pennsylvania State University who studies the intersection of domestic violence and child abuse, was quoted in the aftermath of the Shreveport shooting, drawing an explicit comparison between the Elkins and Fairfax cases. She noted that both perpetrators possessed guns, both were in the middle of contentious divorce proceedings, and both had expressed depressive thoughts to people close to them in the period leading up to the violence. She said that systems need to recognize these patterns as risk factors. The phrase is accurate and inadequate in the same measure. Systems do recognize these patterns. The academic literature recognizes them, the threat assessment field recognizes them, the training curricula for domestic violence advocates and law enforcement recognize them. What the systems do not consistently do is translate that recognition into action at the level of the individual case, because the gap between identifying a risk factor in a research model and applying it to a specific person in a specific household, without a formal report, without a legal basis for intervention, and against the active resistance of everyone inside the relationship who would prefer to keep it private, is a gap that current institutional architecture does not bridge reliably. The Elkins case, mapped against the risk factors the research identifies, produces an uncomfortable picture. Separation was present and documented. A formal court date had been set. The hostility Elkins felt toward the separation was expressed directly to multiple people in the months before the shooting, including his brother, his stepfather, and, according to the accounts of family members, implicitly through his social media posts. Firearm access was present, though it was not legal, and had been obtained through informal channels rather than purchase. Prior threats of violence involving weapons were present, in the form of the 2023 statement to Walker, and in the 2019 episode in which he fired a weapon in a conflict situation. Prior expression of suicidal ideation was present, documented both in the February 2026 attempt that produced a VA hospitalization and in the April theft phone call to his stepfather. Controlling behavior was reported in family accounts of the relationship dynamics. The presence of children whose custody was being actively contested in a court proceeding was present. Financial stress was reported by Walker as a background factor in the relationship's deterioration. What was absent, in the formal sense that institutional systems require, was a police report on domestic violence in the household, a protective order, or a documented credible threat made to law enforcement directly. The CDC's own data on intimate partner homicide, covering the period from 2020 to 2021, found that the proportion of suspects in intimate partner homicide incidents who had contact with law enforcement in the preceding 12 months increased by approximately 30%. The report described this as a potential missed opportunity for prevention. Elkins's name was in the Shreveport Police Department's system, as Police Chief Wayne Smith confirmed after the shooting, but the nature of that prior contact related to his 2019 weapons conviction rather than to any domestic violence complaint. The system had contact. The contact was about a different category of violation. No bridge connected the weapons record to the domestic threat to the February psychiatric crisis to the April phone call. Each piece of information sat in a different repository, held by a different institution, visible only to the people who had been directly in the room when it was produced. The public health framing that emerged in the weeks after the Shreveport shooting, in academic commentary and health journalism, argued that familicide and intimate partner homicide should be approached the way aviation and healthcare approach systemic failures. In aviation, when a plane crashes, investigators examine the entire chain of decisions, equipment states, and environmental conditions that produce the outcome, rather than attributing the crash solely to the proximate cause, the mechanical failure, or the pilot error that occurred at the end. The principle is that crashes do not happen because of a single point of failure. They happen because multiple safeguards failed in sequence. The same analytical frame applied to the Elkins case produces a chain rather than a single cause. The 2019 conviction that should have been more restrictive. The VA discharge that should have been followed by structured community support. The April 5th phone call that ended with a statement about demons and a click without producing a welfare check. The absence of a domestic violence center that might have provided Pew with a place to access safety planning in the months when the separation was escalating. The informal gun economy that put a weapon into the hands of a prohibited person without triggering any alert. The threat made in 2023 that was heard and then filed away as probably nothing. Aviation investigators call the accumulated minor failures that combine to produce a catastrophic outcome the error chain. The Elkins case has an error chain of some length. Identifying it is not the same as assigning blame to any individual person in it. Walker was not a mandated reporter with legal authority to act on what she heard. Troy Brown was doing everything a brother-in-law without clinical training could do. Mahalia Elkins was on the other end of a phone call with a stepson she had only known for a decade. The VA hospital operated within a system that was not designed to provide indefinite hospitalization for people who are no longer in acute crisis. The Shreveport City Council was navigating institutional politics and funding constraints that are not unique to Shreveport. None of those observations absolves the aggregate of producing the outcome it produced. They explain the mechanism by which individually understandable decisions combine into collectively catastrophic results. The research also consistently finds that the population most affected by intimate partner homicide in the United States is not distributed evenly. Black women are killed by intimate partners at rates that exceed their proportion of the general population by a significant margin. During the period studied in the CDC's 2020 to 2021 analysis, Black women constituted approximately 13% of the population, but accounted for roughly 30% of intimate partner homicide victims. That disparity, sustained across multiple years and multiple data sets, reflects structural realities about the distribution of resources available to victims who are seeking to leave dangerous relationships. Access to legal counsel, housing alternatives, financial independence, and the kind of rapid institutional response that would allow a woman to leave a relationship safely without becoming more vulnerable in the process. All of these are distributed unequally in ways that compound the biological and relational risk factors the research identifies. Shaniqua Pugh was a Black woman in Shreveport, seeking a divorce from a man who had told a witness he would kill her if she left. The resources available to her for navigating that process safely were the resources available in a city that had just voted to close the partnership for its domestic violence resource center. The comparison that Penn State's Spearman and others drew between the Fairfax and Elkins cases also highlights something that the coverage of these events tends to flatten. The two cases involved men from entirely different social and economic positions who nonetheless arrived at the same outcome through pathways that share most of their structural features. Justin Fairfax was a Duke-educated lawyer and former state official. Shamar Elkins was a UPS driver and former National Guard private. The differences in their backgrounds, their professional histories, and the social attention their respective cases received are significant. The similarities in the warning signs that preceded their acts are also significant, and arguably more important for understanding how to prevent the next case, whatever social position its perpetrator occupies. Both men were in contested divorce proceedings. Both had accessed firearms. Both had expressed suicidal ideation to people close to them. Both had mental health histories that had been known to medical or clinical systems without producing durable intervention. Both killed their intimate partners in the context of the ending of a long relationship. The research that identifies these warning signs does not sort them by income or education level. They appear across the full spectrum. What the comparison also reveals is something harder to discuss cleanly in any public forum: the question of what intervention would actually look like if a system designed to prevent intimate partner homicide tried to apply the risk factors consistently to a specific case before it became a fatality. The most direct intervention available, in a case where a person has expressed a specific threat naming partner, children, and self as targets, is a civil protective order or, in states that have enacted them, an extreme risk protection order, sometimes called a red flag law. Virginia had enacted a red flag law, passed on a tie-breaking vote cast by Justin Fairfax himself during his tenure as lieutenant governor. Sources noted after the Fairfax killing that the law had not been enforced in his own case. Louisiana, at the time of the Shreveport shooting, did not have a red flag law. Elkins had no protective order against him in connection with his domestic relationships. The formal legal tools that the research on intervention identifies as most effective at physically separating firearms from high-risk individuals were either absent or unapplied, in both cases that defined the week of April 16 through 19, 2026. Nearly 5 women are murdered in the United States every day by a current, former, or estranged intimate partner. That figure, drawn from CDC data, is not a recent development. It reflects a rate that has been documented consistently enough that the researchers who study it no longer find it surprising as a statistical observation, though they remain troubled by it as a human one. 2/3 of mass shootings in the United States are connected to domestic violence in some documented way. 40% of the victims in domestic violence-related mass shootings are children. Those figures appeared in coverage of the Shreveport shooting in the week after April 19th, cited by journalists and researchers who were reaching for context large enough to hold what had happened in Cedar Grove. The numbers do not make what happened to 8 children on West 79th Street easier to understand. They make it harder, because they establish that this was not an aberration. It was the same pattern. Again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The research knew the warning signs. The institutions that could have connected them to a specific family in Cedar Grove did not, for reasons that are structural rather than personal, and that repeat across thousands of cases every year. The final section pulls back further and looks at what Shreveport was left with, what the 8 children were before the morning that ended their lives, and what accountability looks like when the primary person responsible dies at the end of a police chase. Section 10. What remains Forest Park Cemetery West sits on the western edge of Shreveport, a few miles from Cedar Grove, in the kind of institutional quiet that cemeteries carry regardless of the season. On May 9, 2026, 20 days after the shooting, 8 white caskets arrived there in a procession. The children were buried together, as their mothers had requested, because they had died together. Gold crowns and white flowers had been placed on top of the caskets at Summer Grove Baptist Church, where the funeral service had been held that morning. The mourners wore pink and purple and blue. The caskets were arranged with photographs of each child, some of the images showing the children alongside their favorite cartoon characters. Hundreds of people had filed past during the service. The choir had sung. A bishop had spoken about faith. Mayor Arsenault had spoken about presence as a gift and absence as something deeply felt. Then the caskets moved to Forest Park Cemetery West, and the children were placed in the ground together, in a city where more than 30% of murders are domestic in origin, on the weekend before Mother's Day. There are specific things that the funeral pamphlet recorded about each of the 8 children that deserve to exist in the written record of what happened in Shreveport on April 19, 2026. Soraya Snow was 11 years old, the oldest of the 8, the eldest of Christina Snow's 3 children with Elkins. Her teachers remembered her as someone who was always ready to help others. Caddo Parish School Superintendent Keith Burton described her to CNN as a hard worker with a big smile and a great heart. Soraya is the child who would have been a teenager by the end of that year, who would have been old enough, as the eldest sibling, to have understood something of the adult tensions she was growing up inside of. She died in a house on West 79th Street that was not her primary home, but where she had gone to spend the night with her half-siblings, as she had done many times before. Kadarian Snow was 6. He was described by his great-aunt LaShun Berry as having a sweet and loving heart. His funeral pamphlet said that though his life on earth was short, his light was mighty. He had been excited, Berry said, to attend summer camp that coming summer, alongside his older sister Soraya and his younger brother Braylon, where they were going to learn a new trade and take classes. The three of them loved visiting the farm. Braylon Snow was 5. He had the same summer camp plans as his brother, the same excitement about what was coming. Braylon, Kadarian, and Soraya were the 3 children Christina Snow brought into the world with Shamar Elkins, the 3 children who were at the West 79th Street house on the night of April 18, because children move between the homes of their parents' families in ordinary life. All 3 of them died that Sunday morning. Their mother survived with a bullet lodged permanently in her face. Layla Pugh was 7 years old. She was described in the funeral pamphlet as bright, intelligent, bold, and full of love. She enjoyed making TikTok videos with her siblings and cousins. Kayla Pugh was 6. Her family called her K-May. Shayla Elkins was 5. She was described as more reserved than her sisters, a child who would sit quietly scrolling on a phone, watching things unfold rather than inserting herself into them. She and her younger sister Jayla shared an obsession with Lilo and Stitch and Hello Kitty. Jayla Elkins was 3 years old. She was the youngest of the 8. Her family called her J-Bay. She loved unicorns. 3 years old means she had been alive long enough to have a personality, a name for herself, a category of objects she loved, a specific way her family said her name. That is the sum of the documented record of what she was before April 19, 2026. Markadon Pugh was 10 years old. He was the son of Troy Brown, the man who had lived in the West 79th Street house with Elkins and Shaniqua Pugh, the man who had been playing dominoes with Elkins and suggesting walks and asking whether Elkins needed to go back to the hospital. Troy Brown's 10-year-old son died in the house where Brown also lived on a Sunday morning, while Brown's own involvement in trying to hold the situation together had continued right up to the point where it could not be held anymore. The funeral pamphlet called Markadon K-Bug. He was Elkins's nephew by marriage, the cousin of the other 7, the child in the house who was not Elkins's biological son, but who was family in every way that word functions in practice. He was there because it was his home. That is who the 8 children were, as fully as the public record allows them to be described. They were children with nicknames and cartoon preferences and summer camp plans and TikTok habits and small self-presentations that their families had been watching develop for 3 years in the case of the youngest and 11 years in the case of the oldest. They existed in the particular density of ordinary childhood, in a household full of half-siblings and cousins who slept in the same house and visited the farm together and made videos on phones and wore Easter outfits and sat in cars eating burgers while their father photographed them. None of that ordinariness protected them. It was the ordinariness they died inside of, which is part of what makes this kind of violence so hard to absorb and so necessary to describe in full. Shamar Elkins died on Brompton Lane in Bossier City at 7:03 in the morning on April 19, 2026. The preliminary autopsy determined that his death was self-inflicted. He died without facing a criminal trial, without entering a plea, without being sentenced, without having the weight of the law formally applied to what he had done. That is the shape of accountability available in this case, and it is a shape that the families of the 8 children have to live inside of indefinitely. There is no court proceeding in which his guilt will be formally established. There is no sentence whose length can be measured against what the sentence was for the children. The U.S. Attorney said in the weeks after the shooting that Elkins's death meant the community would never see him face justice. That is accurate. What the community has instead is the record and the federal prosecutions of the 2 men whose prohibited possession of firearms contributed to his ability to carry out the attack. Charles Ford will be sentenced in October 2026 for possessing the Mossberg 715P and lying about it to federal agents. The sentence will be whatever it is. It will not be commensurate with the outcome that followed from his decision to keep a stolen gun under his truck seat rather than report it missing. Michael Mayence awaits trial on the charge of possessing 4 firearms in his home while subject to a domestic violence protection order. The outcome of that case will be determined by the federal court process. The two prosecutions together represent what the formal legal system can reach in the absence of the primary perpetrator, which is the chain below the act rather than the act itself. The Shreveport City Council's pilot domestic violence program at the North Shreveport Police Substation began operations in the spring of 2026, with the Northwest Louisiana Family Justice Center providing coverage on a schedule that represented a fraction of what a full-time resource center would have offered. The Louisiana legislature continued debating the proposed habitual domestic violence offender registry bills through the regular session. The VA system from which Elkins had been discharged in February continued operating without any public accounting of how his discharge was determined or what follow-up, if any, was recommended. The Shreveport Police Department's public record of its prior contact with Elkins, which the police chief confirmed existed, remained in the system without having been connected to the accumulating signs around him in the 2 months between that February discharge and April 19th. What this video has traced, from the first section to this one, is a sequence of failures that are individually understandable and collectively catastrophic. The legal structure that produced a 2019 plea to a reduced charge rather than a conviction carrying a permanent firearms ban. The informal gun economy in which 2 prohibited persons, who both had domestic violence in their own records, held a firearm between them without any alarm registering in any system. The domestic violence infrastructure that was planned, argued over, funded at the council level, undermined by internal politics, and dissolved in a vote on March 24th, 26 days before the shooting. The VA hospitalization that identified a crisis, provided 10 days of care, and then returned a man to the same household in the same separation and the same escalating despair without structured community support. The April 5 phone call in which a stepfather said the right things and a man said some people don't come back from their demons and then hung up, and no welfare check was performed, and 14 days passed. And beneath all of that, and longer than any of it, the threat made in 2023 to a woman who was considering leaving. "If you try to leave, I will kill you, my kids, and myself." The threat was heard. It was heard by Betty Walker, the woman who had raised Elkins, and who knew what it meant to hear it from him specifically, in that relationship, at that moment. She chose to believe it was nothing. The research on threats of that precise construction, the ones that name the partner and the children and the self together as the combined target of the perpetrator's final act, says consistently that they are not nothing. They are the most reliable warning available inside a family system, stated in plain language, to a person close enough to the situation to understand the context. The research existed. Walker did not have access to it. She had only her knowledge of a man she had raised and her hope that the thing he said was what people sometimes say when they are frightened and cornered, rather than what he intended. The 8 caskets arrived at Forest Park Cemetery West in a procession and were placed in the ground. The mourners wore the colors the families had chosen. The governor ordered flags to fly at half-staff for 8 days, 1 day for each child. On the first day the flags flew at half-staff. They flew for Jayla, the youngest, called J-Bay, who loved unicorns. On the second day, they flew for Shayla, who scrolled quietly on her phone and loved the same cartoons as her little sister. On the third day, they flew for Kayla, who her family called K-May. On the fourth day, they flew for Layla, who made TikTok videos and was bright and bold and full of love. On the fifth day, they flew for Kadarian, who had a sweet and loving heart and was going to summer camp. On the sixth day, they flew for Braylon, who was going to summer camp too, with his brother and sister. On the seventh day, they flew for Marcaden, called K-Bug, who was 10 years old and who died in his own home. On the eighth day, they flew for Soraya, who was 11 years old and a hard worker and always ready to help others, and who had a big smile and a great heart. 2 women survived. Christina Snow, with a bullet in her face, left the hospital with nowhere to go and no financial support in the immediate aftermath. Shaniqua Pugh, with a bullet in her face, sometimes wakes in the morning before full consciousness and in those first seconds the children are still alive. Then the morning assembles itself completely, and the knowledge returns, and she begins the day again. Both women had been warned, in different ways and at different times, about what Elkins was capable of. Both of them had been navigating a situation that the city around them had documented, discussed, passed resolutions about, and failed to adequately resource. Both of them will carry what April 19 left them for the rest of their lives. Cedar Grove is the same neighborhood it was before that Sunday morning. The streets are the same. The houses are the same modest single-story structures on narrow lots with chain-link fences and front porches close to the sidewalk. Freddie Montgomery still lives across the street from the house where the children died. Whether he still looks through the curtains in the direction of that address is not part of the public record. The address itself still exists, on the 300 block of West 79th Street, in the southern part of a city of 180,000 people, where more than 30% of murders are domestic in origin, where the Domestic Violence Resource Center was closed in March and reopened in April, where the bills for a public registry of repeat offenders move through a legislature that is acting in the wake of something that the registry would not have intercepted, because Shamar Elkins had no domestic violence record. The threat was made in a room 3 years before anyone died. It was specific. It named everyone in it. And then life continued around it for 3 years, until the morning it stopped continuing. That is the story this video has told. These are the children it happened to. This is the city it happened in. This is what was missed, and what it cost, and what was left behind. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.